The night the old woman wandered into his dying kitchen, Amos Whitfield fed her the last good thing he had, and never asked her name. He gave up his cot. When the hard men came knocking, he stood in his own doorway and did not move. By morning, a man with a stillness like a loaded gun had come quietly down that narrow street to his door and asked, softly, for Mama Zara. What that man learned before noon would cancel a wedding, break a treaty, and end everything he believed about the man who raised him. 2 nights before the wedding, Lazar Varga sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 30, and watched his mother refuse to eat. The dining hall of the Varga estate had been built to intimidate. Black marble ran the length of the floor, polished, until it threw back the light of the chandeliers like still water. The walls were bare of anything a man could love. No photographs, no color, nothing a bullet would regret. Lazar had ordered it that way. A room with nothing soft in it was a room that told you exactly who held the leash the moment you crossed the threshold, and he had learned long ago that comfort was a language his enemies mistook for weakness. Across from him sat the Volkovs, and at their center, wrapped in gray silk, the color of a knife, sat the woman he was going to marry. Sabine Volkov ate the way she did everything, with a cold and total economy. She cut her food into small, even pieces, and set her knife down between each bite, and never once looked at him with anything a person might mistake for warmth. That suited him. Lazar had not asked for warmth. He had asked for the shipping lanes her father controlled along the northern river, and in 2 days he would have them, and in return, the Volkovs would fold their laundered money through the Varga banks, and both families would grow fat and untouchable, and the long cold hatred between them would finally settle into paper instead of blood. It was a good arrangement. It was the best his family had been offered in a generation, and everyone at that table understood it. Everyone except the small, furious woman at the far end of it. Zara Varga was 63 years old and built like a sparrow, and had buried a husband and 2 brothers in the life her son now ran. She wore her good dress, the deep red one, because she knew it unsettled the Volkovs to sit across from a widow who refused to dress as though she were already in mourning. She had not touched her plate. "You have handed my grandmother's kitchen to caterers," she said suddenly, in the flat, clear voice that had once ended arguments among killers. The whole table turned. "The lamb is cooked the way rich people like it, soft, obedient. Dead before it reached the fire, it tastes like the inside of a bank." "Mama," Lazar said quietly. She looked at him. She had his eyes, or he had hers, the same dark, unhurried gaze that other people found so difficult to sit beneath. For a moment, something passed between them that no one else in the room could read, the private grammar of a mother and a son who had loved each other through a great deal of terrible weather. "I am only saying," Zara went on, "that a woman should be allowed to taste one real thing before she watches her only boy get sold off like a warehouse." Anatoly Volkov laughed the way powerful men laugh, at what does not amuse them, to prove they cannot be wounded. Sabine did not laugh. She lifted her water, drank, and let the insult run off her like rain off marble. Lazar felt the old pressure gather at the base of his skull. He loved his mother with a ferocity that frightened him, because she was the single place left in his ordered world where he could still be reached. And it was precisely because of that love that he had spent years building walls around her, 2 guards at all hours, a car she was not permitted to drive, a whole neighborhood she was no longer allowed to visit, the crowded, loud stretch of the Old South Quarter where she had raised him above a butcher shop, because the Volkovs and every family like them knew that the shortest road to a careful man ran straight through the one careless thing he could not stop loving. She hated the walls. She told him so at least once a week. Tonight, she only set her napkin beside her uneaten plate, folded her small hands, and stared down the length of the black table at the future her son had built, and Lazar saw, with a discomfort he could not name, that she was not angry. She was sad, and his mother was never sad. His mother was a fist in a red dress. Sadness on her looked as wrong as frost on a lit stove. After the plates were cleared, the men talked business in the low, unhurried way of people who have never once feared being overheard. Anatoly wanted assurances about the rehearsal, the guest list, which of his cousins would be permitted to carry a weapon inside the church. Lazar gave him everything he asked for. It cost him nothing. In 2 days it would all be one family, and a man does not fear his own left hand. When he finally rose, it was close to midnight. Sabine offered him her cheek and he kissed it, and neither of them felt anything at all, and both of them found this perfectly acceptable, which was, Lazar would think later, its own kind of warning he had been too proud to hear. He went to find his mother to say goodnight. She was standing at the tall window at the end of the East Hall, looking out at the black lawn and the high wall and the far lights of the city. She was no longer allowed to walk through. He stood beside her a while without speaking. That was a thing they could still do. "I will take you to the old quarter," he said at last. When this is finished, and it is safe, I will walk it with you myself. I promise." Zara reached up and patted his cheek with a hand that had grown lighter than he remembered, and she smiled at him in a way that did not reach her eyes. "Of course you will, my heart," she said. "Go to sleep now." He should have heard it. For the rest of his life, he would return to that hallway and that soft, ruined smile, and understand that his mother had already decided something, and that he had walked past her decision as though it were a piece of furniture. But he was tired, and he was to be married in 2 days, and the great machine of his life was running exactly as he had built it to run. So he kissed the top of her silver head, and he went to bed, and he did not set a third man on her door. The call came a little after 4 in the morning, and Lazar Varga was awake before the second ring, because men in his position did not sleep so much as wait between emergencies. It was Silas. Silas had stood at Lazar's shoulder for 11 years, a wide, quiet man with a boxer's ruined hands and a loyalty that had never once bent, and Lazar knew from the single flattened word he offered, "boss," that something had torn loose in the fabric of the night. "Your mother is gone," Silas said. "Her room is empty, the bed is made, the pantry window is open, and the censor on it has been cut. Not forced. Cut. Careful hands." Lazar sat up. The dark of his bedroom did not change, but something at the center of his chest went very cold and very still, the way a pond goes still under the first hard frost. "Both guards," he said. "Asleep," Silas said, and the word left him like something he was ashamed to be holding. "Nikolai and the new man both. Down at their post by the stair. I have already smelled their coffee. There was something in it, boss." They did not sit and doze, they were put down, and there it was. The first splinter, working its way beneath his skin. A stranger could not drug the coffee of 2 guards inside the Varga estate. A stranger could not find the one pantry censor a person might reach from outside without crossing the open lawn. Whoever had emptied his mother's room had walked these halls before, had eaten at these tables, had been trusted enough to learn where the soft places in the wall were kept. Lazar was already dressing. His hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing people misjudged about him, every time. Right up until the moment it was too late to matter. The angrier and more afraid Lazar Varga became, the calmer his hands grew. "Who knew she was unhappy?" he said. Silence on the line. They both knew the answer was everyone. Everyone had watched her push her plate away 2 nights running. Everyone had heard her call the marriage a sale. "Get me the gate footage," Lazar said. "All of it. And wake the house, softly. If she was taken, the men who took her want me loud and stupid and running the wrong way by sunrise. We are going to be none of those things." The footage told him almost nothing, which told him a great deal. A little after midnight, a single figure crossed the far corner of the east camera and was gone. Small, unhurried, beneath something plain and dark, he could still make out the hem of the good red coat. She had not been dragged. She had not been carried. She had walked to the edge of the frame with the steady, patient step of a woman who had timed the sweep of her son's cameras the way she once timed the cooling of bread, And then she had stepped into the blind seam between two lenses that only a person who lived here could have known was there. For one full breath, Lazar felt something he had not expected. Not fear, relief, quick and shameful. She had gone on her own. No one had her. Then the second thought arrived, and took the relief apart in his hands. If his mother had drugged two guards and cut a sensor and walked out alone into the dark 2 nights before he handed his family to the Volkovs, then someone inside these walls had helped her do it. And his mother, 63 and grieving a life she was no longer permitted to live, was loose somewhere in the sleeping city, with no guard, no car, and a name that in the wrong mouth was worth more than any cargo on Anatoly Volkov's river. "Silas," he said, and his voice dropped into the quiet, even tone that made older men in his organization lose the color in their faces. "Bring the car around, just you." He was pulling on his coat now, and for the first time in 3 years, he was thinking of a narrow, loud street above a butcher shop in the South Quarter, the only patch of earth his mother had ever truly wanted to stand on. Not the Volkovs yet. Not a war yet. First, I am going to the one place she still dreams about when she thinks no one is watching her sleep. Pray to whatever you pray to that I reach her there, before anyone else remembers she used to live there too. The South Quarter woke the way it always had, all at once and without apology. By the time Silas turned the car off the highway and down into the old streets, the sky had gone the bruised gray of early morning, and the quarter was already loud, shutters rattling up over shop fronts. A man hosing fish blood off the pavement in front of a market, 2 women shouting to each other across a narrow street, in a language Lazar had grown up hearing through the floorboards. The smell came through the vents before he rolled the window down, bread and diesel and frying onions and the river, and it went into him like a key into a lock he had welded shut on purpose years ago. He had grown up 4 streets from here above a butcher shop that no longer existed, in 3 rooms that had always smelled of his mother's cooking. He had not driven these blocks in years. He had told himself it was for her safety. Sitting in the car now, watching a boy chain a bicycle to a lamppost the way he once had, he let himself understand the other half of the truth. He had stayed away because the quarter remembered a version of him that had been poor and frightened and loved, and he had spent his whole adult life making certain no one could ever find that boy and use him. They passed the corner where the butcher shop had once stood. It was a phone store, now bright and empty, its shutters still down for the morning, and Lazar looked at the doorway where he had sat as a boy, shelling peas into a bowl in his lap, while his mother worked the counter, and his father laughed with the men who came to buy, and to talk, and sometimes to be quietly told what the family expected of them. He had been happy there and had not known it, which he understood now was the only true way a person is ever happy. He had spent 30 years, and no small amount of blood making certain he would never again be that soft or that reachable. And in the doing he had built his mother a beautiful cage and called it love, and left her to rattle the bars of it alone. If she died in this quarter tonight, it would be because he had turned the one place she felt like herself into the one place he would not let her go. "Where we start," Silas said. "Where she would go," Lazar said. They started at the church, because his mother still lit candles there on the days that mattered, and the old woman sweeping the steps had not seen her. They tried the market, where she had bought fish for 40 years, and the man behind the counter crossed himself when he saw Lazar's face and swore on his children he had seen no one. That was the trouble with a name like Varga. It closed mouths faster than money. It was a girl who broke it open. She could not have been more than 9, sitting on a stoop in a coat too big for her. And when Silas showed her the photograph, she did not go pale the way the grown people did. She looked at it a long moment, and then pointed with her whole hand, the way children point, down toward the river end of the quarter. "The grandmother who cannot find her street," the girl said. "She was crying by the water last night." Amos took her in, and then she frowned, and added the thing that turned the cold in Lazar's chest to ice. The men came looking for her, after the ones in the good car. My papa made me come inside. Lazar crouched down until he was level with her. What men? He said, in the gentle voice he almost never used. What did the good car look like? Black, she said, shiny, like yours, and two men who did not knock like people who are lost. They knocked like people who are angry. Lazar stood. He and Silas did not look at each other because they did not need to. Somebody else had already found the thread and pulled it in the night. Somebody with a black car and no fear of the quarter and no reason to be gentle with a lost old woman, hours before her own son had even found her trail. They left the car and went on foot, because the streets down by the water were too narrow for it, and because Lazar did not want the engine announcing him. Silas walked with his hand loose inside his jacket. The buildings leaned closer here, older, their faces patched and repatched, and at the very end where the street gave out onto a gray slice of river stood a low brick storefront with a hand-painted sign gone soft with weather, Whitfield's. Home cooking. The windows were dark, the lights were off. But the door frame was splintered near the latch, the wood freshly pale where something had been forced and had held, and pressed to the inside of the glass, hung there like a small red flag, was the hem of a coat Lazar Varga would have known in his sleep. He drew his weapon. He did not remember deciding to. And with Silas at his shoulder, and his heart going like a fist against a door, Lazar reached out and turned the handle of the dark and silent kitchen, where, for all he knew, his mother had spent her last night on earth. The door gave inward without a sound. The kitchen was small and clean and cold, the ovens dark, the air still holding the ghost of something that had been cooked with care many hours before. Chairs stood upturned on the tables. And between Lazar and the closed door at the back of the room, a man rose up out of the dark, like something the building itself had grown for its own defense. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, near Lazar's own age, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and a dish towel still tucked into the tie of his apron, as though he had been interrupted in the middle of an ordinary life. One side of his face was badly marked. His lip was split, one eye swollen nearly shut. A dark bruise spreading across the cheekbone. He held no gun. He held a heavy iron pan, the kind a man could break a skull with if he were desperate enough and had nothing else. And he held it low and ready and perfectly steady, and he put his broad body squarely between Lazar and that back door. "You are not taking her," the man said. His voice was low and wrecked and absolutely certain. "I told your friends the same last night. You can do to me what they started. You are still not taking her." For a moment, Lazar did not move, and the whole cold room hung on the edge of turning violent. Then he understood. This man, bleeding, unarmed but for a pan, standing between a stranger's gun and a back room in the last hour before dawn, did not know who Lazar was. He did not know he was looking at the most dangerous man in the city. He thought Lazar was only the next in a line of hard men come in the night for the old woman crying by the river, and he had decided, plainly, to die in his own doorway before he let another one past. Lazar had built his life on reading people in the half-second before they lied. He looked at this battered man and found no lie anywhere in him. He crouched, slowly, set his weapon down on the nearest table, and slid it away from himself across the wood. "I am not here to hurt her," Lazar said. "The woman you took in, small, a red coat, 63 years old and impossible. Is she alive?" Something in the man's face flickered. The pan did not lower. "Who is asking?" "Her son," Lazar said, and the word came out of him, rougher than he expected, scraped raw on the way up. "I am her son." She stood in the gap of it, wrapped in a blanket that was not hers, tiny and gray-faced, and blinking against the gloom, her silver hair loose around her shoulders in a way Lazar had not seen since he was a boy. For 1 second his mother looked at him as though she were not certain he was real. Then her whole fierce face crumpled and reassembled itself into fury, which was the only way Zara Varga had ever known to show that she had been afraid. "You took your time," she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle. Lazar crossed the room. He did not run, because he did not run. But he was around the tables and had her small body gathered against his chest before he had decided to move. And she was shaking, and she was so light, lighter even than she had been the night before at his black table, and she smelled of wood smoke and someone else's soap, and beneath it, of herself. Of the one safe thing in the whole ruined architecture of his life. He put his hand against the back of her head the way a man does with something that has almost broken. "I am here," he said into her hair. "I have you. I am here." Behind them, slowly, the man with the iron pan lowered it to his side. Later, when the ovens had been lit again for warmth and his mother had been settled into a chair, with her hands wrapped around a cup she kept refusing to set down, Lazar made the man sit too, and he stood over him in that small kitchen and made him tell it. His name was Amos Whitfield, the place was his, the last thing that was his, and it had been dying by inches for a year. He had been alone in the dark kitchen well past 1 in the morning, closing up far later than he should have when he found her outside, turned around and soaked and frightened, insisting she lived on a street that had been torn down 20 years before. He did not know her, he had not asked her name, because she seemed ashamed of being unable to find her own way home, and a man does not shame a guest. He had brought her in out of the cold. He had made her eat real food lamb the way it was meant to be, hot and full of fire, and she had wept over the first bite in a way that embarrassed them both. He had given her his cot in the back and taken the chair for himself, and a little before 3 in the morning, 2 men, in a black car, had knocked on his door. They had not asked. They had told him to hand over the old woman, and when he said there was no old woman, they had shown him what they thought of the answer. He had not given her up. He had bled and he had lied and he had stood in his own doorway with this same iron pan until a light came on in the apartment above, and a neighbor began shouting about the police, and the 2 men had decided an old woman was not worth a scene, and had gone. To regroup, Amos figured, to come back quieter. He had spent the rest of the night waiting for the door to open again, which was why, when it finally had, he had been standing in the dark with a pan in his hand, ready to die badly for a woman whose name he still did not know. Lazar Varga had come to that street braced to find the worst, a captive or a loss he would spend the rest of his life avenging. He had not been prepared for this. He had not been prepared to walk into a failing kitchen at the ragged end of the quarter and learn that the only person in the entire city who had stood between his mother and the dark that night was a broke stranger with a pan, who had wanted nothing, who had not even known there was a reward or a punishment attached to her, who had simply decided that a frightened old woman was worth his blood. For a long time, Lazar could not speak. In his world, that kind of thing did not exist. In his world, every act carried a price tag, and every kindness was a down payment on a debt. He looked at Amos Whitfield's ruined face and felt something shift in his chest that he had no name for and no defense against. "Why?" he finally said. It came out almost angry. "Why would you do that? You did not know her. You could have been killed for nothing." Amos looked back at him steadily out of his one good eye. "She was somebody's mother," he said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "Somewhere. She was somebody's mother. I fed her because she was hungry. I stood in the door because that is what you do." He glanced at Zara, and the wreck of his face softened. "Besides, nobody has cried over my cooking in a long time. A man forgets he can still do a little good in the world." Across the little kitchen, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, Mama Zara looked at her son and lifted her chin, and in her red-rimmed eyes was a thing Lazar had not seen there in 2 years, not fear, not sadness. Triumph. "Now," she said. "Now you will listen to me." His mother would not tell it sitting down. She got to her feet, one hand on the table, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and she told it standing, the way she had told him everything that ever truly mattered. 3 nights ago, she had not been able to sleep. She had gone down through the dark house, toward the kitchen, the way she still did when her heart was heavy, and she had heard a voice she loved coming from behind the door of the study. "Ambrose, your uncle, my husband's brother?" Lazar went very still. Ambrose had taught him to shoot. Ambrose had stood at his father's grave, with his hand on the back of Lazar's neck, and promised the boy that the family would hold. Ambrose had been the one who first said the word Volkov to him months ago, who had walked him through every clause of the merger, who had called it the smartest thing 3 generations of Vargas had ever done. He was not alone in there, Zara said. There was a phone on the desk with the sound turned up, and on it was one of the river people, not the girl. The father, Anatoly. "And I stood in my own hallway, in my nightgown, Lazar, and I listened to your uncle and that man agree on how they would be rid of you." The kitchen was silent except for the tick of the cooling oven. "Not before the wedding," she went on, and her voice did not shake now. It had gone flat and terrible. The voice of a woman reading aloud a sentence already carried out at the wedding. In the church, in front of everyone, so that it would look like the work of some third family, some old enemy, crawling up out of the past. "Anatoly takes the ports and the banks through his daughter, who is your widow, before she is ever your wife, and Ambrose." She stopped. "Ambrose gets to sit at the head of your table and grieve you in front of the whole city and run what is left. He sold you, my heart. The man who taught you to hold a gun sold you for a chair." Lazar heard the words land, one after another, like coins dropped onto marble. He did not rage. He did not move. Somewhere far down inside him a door he had kept propped open his whole life. The door, with Ambrose's name over it, swung quietly shut. "Why you not came to me?" he said, though even as he asked it, he already knew. His mother laughed, a short, broken sound. "Because you would not have believed me." She said it without cruelty, which made it worse. "You have wanted this marriage for a year. You have called me a bitter old woman who cannot let her son grow up. If I had come to you with nothing more than what I heard through a door, you would have kissed my head and sent me to bed and told Ambrose to keep a closer watch on me." And then her eyes filled. "And then I would have stood in a church and watched them bury you." So she had done the only thing a Varga woman knew how to do. She had gotten proof. She reached into the pocket of the borrowed blanket and drew out a phone Lazar had never seen. Small and black and cheap. The kind of phone a man buys when he does not want the phone he already owns to remember what he is about to say. Ambrose's second phone. She had taken it from the drawer of the study desk while the house slept, along with, she admitted, one clean, unhurried theft that made Lazar want to laugh and to weep at once. The last of the good coffee which she had brewed and carried with her own 2 hands to the 2 men set to guard her door. "You drugged them yourself," Lazar said. "I raised you in a house full of men who believed a woman in a kitchen could not hear them," she said. "I have been putting people to sleep and waking them again my whole life. The sensor on the pantry window has been broken since before your father died. I cut it myself once with a paring knife, only to feel the night air on my face. I know this house better than you know your own hands, Lazar. I did not need a traitor to help me leave." She lifted her small chin. "I only needed to be underestimated, which, thanks to your uncle, I have had a great deal of practice at." It fell together then, in the cold, clean way that terrible things do once a man has the shape of them. There had been no traitor helping his mother out a window. His mother had done that herself, brilliantly, alone. But Ambrose had woken to a missing phone and a missing sister-in-law, and understood at once what both absences meant, and Ambrose could not go to Lazar either, could not raise the alarm, because to explain why the old woman mattered was to explain what lived on the phone. So Ambrose had done it quietly. He had sent his own men, hard men in a good black car, down into a quarter they assumed no one would shield a stranger in, to find the woman and the phone before her son ever knew she was gone. Which meant the men who had bled Amos Whitfield in the night had not been Volkov's at all. They had been Varga, his own, Ambrose's. which meant Ambrose already knew that his mother had run, and had run toward the truth, and had not yet been caught. Which meant this kitchen, this failing little kitchen, down by the water, with its splintered door, and its brave broken owner, was the most dangerous place in the city to be standing, because it was the one place Ambrose's men had already been, and had left empty-handed. Lazar looked at Amos Whitfield, who had gone quiet in his chair, following only half of it, but enough. Enough to understand that the old woman he had fed was not lost at all, that her name was a Blade, and that in standing in his own doorway with a pan, he had walked into the middle of a war between wolves. "The men from last night," Lazar said to him. "The ones you turned away. Describe the car." "Describe them," Amos did. And with every detail, the young dark-haired one, with the scar across the back of his hand, the older one who did the talking and wore a gray signet ring, the way they moved, as though they owned the street. The last small hope Lazar had been holding, that his mother had misheard, that there was some innocent shape to all of this, went out like a snuffed candle. He knew the young one. He knew the ring. "Ambrose," Lazar said softly, to no one at all. And outside, at the mouth of the narrow street, an engine that had been idling for some time slid smoothly into gear. Lazar did not run to the window. Running to a window was how careful men got shot through curtains. He crossed to the side of the glass instead, flat against the brick, and looked out along the seam of the frame. A dark sedan sat at the mouth of the street with its lights off and its engine live, and a man had already stepped out of the passenger's side and was standing in the road, buttoning his jacket over something heavier than a wallet. Even at this distance, Lazar knew the walk. He knew the shoulders. Ambrose did not hire strangers for careful work. He used family, and family had faces. Lazar had eaten dinner beside. "Back door," Lazar said, already moving. "Silas, take the front of us. Mama, Amos, you walk between us, and you do exactly what I say, the instant I say it." Amos did not argue, which Lazar noted and filed away. A broke cook with a caved-in face falling into step, behind a man he had met only that morning, as though he had done this all his life. Zara gathered her red coat off the door where it had hung all night, and put it on with the dignity of a woman dressing for church. The back of the kitchen gave onto a service alley that ran down to the waterline, close and wet and smelling of old grease and the river. They went along it fast and low. Behind them, at the front of the shop, Lazar heard the splintered door give the rest of the way, heard boots come into the empty kitchen, and heard a voice he half knew swear softly at the upturned chairs and the coffee cup still warm on the table. They were almost to the mouth of the alley when the second man stepped into it. He came around the corner from the waterline with a phone in one hand and his other hand reaching under his coat. A young man, unhurried, certain, the way Ambrose's people were always certain. And for a quarter of a second he and Lazar looked at each other in the gray light, and each understood the other completely. Silas was faster. Silas had always been faster than he had any right to be for a man his size. He crossed the space between them without seeming to hurry, and took the reaching arm and turned it and put the young man down against the brick with a sound like a sack of flour dropped from a height. One short, economical motion. No gun, no noise. And then his wide hand was over the man's mouth, and his knee was in his back, and he looked up at Lazar and gave a single small shake of his head. "Not dead. Only sleeping." Lazar nodded. There would be a time for the rest of it, and it would not be in an alley in front of his mother. They went out at the waterline and along the crumbling embankment to where a second car, a plain gray one that belonged to no family and drew no eye, waited exactly where Silas had left it against such a morning, because Silas prepared for mornings like this, the way other men prepared for rain. The safe house was a narrow flat above a shuttered laundry on the north edge of the city, a place with no name on any Varga paper, a place Lazar kept for the days. A man in his position needs to stop existing for a while. It had heat and locks, and a window with a view of the only stair. He put his mother in the one good chair and wrapped her in a blanket that was actually hers, and watched the color come back into her face by degrees. And for the length of a held breath, with the door bolted and Silas at the window, and Amos lowering himself stiffly onto the arm of the couch, it felt almost like safety. Then Lazar's phone rang, the real one, the one his family called, and the name on the screen was Ambrose. The room went still. Zara's hand tightened on the blanket. Lazar looked at the name for one ring, then a second, feeling the shape of the trap flex around him, and then he answered it in the easy, unbothered voice of a nephew who had noticed nothing, who was exactly where he was supposed to be, who had not spent the last hour watching his uncle's men bleed a stranger's kitchen. "Ambrose," he said warmly, "it is early, Lazar." His uncle's voice was the same as it had always been, gravel and honey, the voice that had read to him as a boy. "Tell me you are sitting somewhere with coffee, and not doing something foolish the day before your own wedding. I went by the estate this morning." He paused, and the pause was a knife wrapped in cloth. "Your mother's room is empty, son. Nobody can find her. I have men out looking everywhere. I am worried sick. Tell me you know where she is." And there it was. The lie offered gently, an open hand held out. "Come, put your fear in mine. Let me carry it, let me get close." Lazar looked across the little room at his mother, alive, furious, wrapped in her own blanket, and at the broke stranger who had bled to keep her that way, and he smiled a smile that did not reach anything. "No," he said. "God, no. I have been going out of my mind. Find her for me, Ambrose. You are the only one I trust with this." He hung up before the warmth could curdle, and set the phone face down on the table. And in the ringing quiet, Amos Whitfield said, very softly, "So that is the uncle." Lazar looked at him. "Yes," he said, "that is the uncle." Amos nodded slowly, as though a last, small hope of his own had gone out. "Then you are going to need more than a pan," he said. The doctor came within the hour, a lean, unsmiling woman named Sable who had set Varga bones for years and asked Varga questions never, and she cleaned and taped the ruin of Amos Whitfield's face with brisk, indifferent hands and told him he had a cracked cheekbone and heavy bruising. "Rest," she said, packing her bag. "No more doorways." Then she looked at Lazar a moment, at the flat and the old woman, and the bleeding stranger, filed exactly none of it aloud, and left. Amos did not rest. Lazar had half expected it. A man who would stand in a doorway for a stranger was not a man who knew how to sit still while other people were hungry, and within the half hour he had found the safe-house kitchen, such as it was, a narrow galley with a two-burner stove and a nearly empty cupboard, and he stood in front of it in his taped-up face, frowning at a bag of rice and 3 tired onions and a single wrinkled lemon as though they were a problem he could actually solve. "You should be lying down," Lazar said. "I think better on my feet," Amos said. "And your mother has not eaten since the lamb, and neither have you. And a man cannot plan a war on an empty stomach." He said war the way another man might say weather, without flinching, and began, one-handed, to peel an onion. Zara was up out of her good chair before Lazar could stop her. What happened next, Lazar would remember for the rest of his life with a strange, helpless ache, because he had nowhere to put it. His mother crossed the little flat and took the knife gently out of the stranger's clumsy grip and told him to sit, that a man with a broken face did not chop onions, that he could tell her what to do, and she would do it. And Amos, to Lazar's amazement, obeyed her, lowered himself onto a stool at the counter and began to teach her his own kitchen from memory. A little oil. Let it get lazy and gold, not brown. Brown is anger. Gold is patience. Now the rice. Let it drink the sound of the pan. And Zara Varga, who had run a house full of killers, who had faced down the Volkovs across a black marble table the night before without blinking, stood at a stranger's stove in a borrowed kitchen and cooked to a wounded man's instructions, and laughed, actually laughed, at something he said too low for Lazar to hear. Lazar stood in the doorway and watched them, and felt like a man looking through a window into a house he had been locked out of years ago. Then his mother, without turning around, said, "Lazar, the lemon. Do not stand there like a landlord. Zest it." And Lazar Varga, who had ordered the deaths of men that very week, who owned banks and ports and half the harbor police, picked up the wrinkled lemon and the small dull grater from the drawer and stood at the counter between his mother and the broke stranger and grated lemon into a bowl because his mother had told him to. And somewhere in the doing of it he was 8 years old again, over a butcher shop, shelling peas into his lap while the grown people talked, warm and safe and loved and not yet anything the world could use. It was over the food that Amos told the rest of it, because that was where he seemed to keep the true things. The kitchen, at the end of the quarter, had been his wife's before it was his. Her name had been Ruth. She had wanted her whole life one clean, bright room where she could feed people who were tired, and they had scraped and borrowed and gone without for a dozen years to buy it, and they had run it together for 6 good ones. And then a fast, quiet cancer had taken her in a single autumn and left him alone in the one bright room with all her recipes in her own hand in a box beside the register. He had kept it open because closing it felt like burying her twice. He fed people because when he cooked for a stranger, for a moment, he could feel her standing at his shoulder, telling him the oil was getting angry. But grief was expensive, and the neighborhood was poor, and the bank did not care whose ghost lived in the kitchen. And in 3 weeks, Amos said, in 3 weeks they were going to take it. And he had made his peace with that, he thought, right up until a lost old woman had wandered in out of the dark and wept over his lamb and reminded him what the room had been for. "So you see," he said, looking at Zara with the softened wreck of his face, "you did me the favor. Not the other way around. I had forgotten I was still good for something. You walked in and I remembered." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Zara reached across the little counter and took the big man's battered hand in both of her small ones and held it, and she said, "You will call me Mama Zara, the way everyone I have ever fed does. And you will stop speaking of that kitchen as though it is already gone." And Amos Whitfield, who had buried his wife and was about to bury the last room she ever loved, put his ruined face down and wept quietly over a stranger's stove, while an old woman held his hand and a mafia boss stood very still, with a bowl of lemon zest and understood exactly what he was going to spend his money on. Later, when they had eaten, and it was good, it was so much better than anything that had ever come out of the estate's sterile kitchen, and his mother had finally fallen asleep in the good chair, with color in her face. Lazar stepped out onto the small iron balcony above the shuttered laundry and looked at the cold, bright city that belonged to him and to Ambrose, and, by tomorrow, was meant to belong to the Volkovs over his own dead body. Silas followed him out and stood beside him and said nothing, because Silas knew when talk was a courtesy and when it was a burden. "He wants the wedding," Lazar said at last, quietly to the city. "He needs it. The church, the crowd, the story, it only works if I walk in believing it." He turned the cheap dead weight of Ambrose's second phone over in his hand, the proof his mother had bled the whole night to carry out of that house. Then Lazar smiled, and it was not a warm thing, and Silas felt the temperature of the whole balcony drop. "So we are going to give him his wedding," Lazar said, "every bit of it. Right up until the part where he finds out. The groom already knows." He did not sleep. Careful men rarely did. The night before a reckoning, and Lazar had stopped pretending years ago. He sat at the little table, with Ambrose's cheap phone and a pair of cracked earbuds he had taken off Silas, and he made himself listen to all of it, every saved voice memo and every message. The whole patient architecture of his own undoing laid out in the 2 voices he had trusted most in the world after his mother. Anatoly Volkov, precise and bored, a man ordering a death the way he would order a shipment, and Ambrose, warm even here, warm while he sold his brother's son, talking through the timing the third family they would frame, The way the crowd in the church would carry the story out into the city for them before the shock had even worn off. "He is sentimental about the church," Ambrose said on the recording. "Of his own nephew, he will want his mother in the front row. Put our people on that row. If she makes noise afterward, she is only an old woman undone by grief. No one will listen to her." Lazar took the earbuds out. He sat in the dark a while. The cost of the thing was not the ports, or the banks, or even the ambush. The cost was that he had loved Ambrose, had modeled the whole cold architecture of himself on the man, and that every warm memory he owned now had to be taken down and checked for wire. That was what betrayal from the inside truly stole. Not your life, your past. Before dawn, he put the question to Silas plainly, because Silas would not soften it, and Lazar could not afford softness now. How many of ours are actually his? Silas was quiet for a long moment, which was its own answer. "I have been counting since the alley," he said finally. The two he sent to the quarter were Ambrose's own, close men. Men who came up under him. But it is worse than two, boss. Think about who runs your personal detail. Who Ambrose recommended for it. Who he has been putting near you for a year, a little at a time, a good man here, a cousin there, all of them loyal to the uncle who vouched for them. He paused. "If you walk into that church tomorrow and give an order, you will not know which of your own guns turns to face the wrong way. I trust 6 men in this whole city. 6, out of the hundreds who call you boss. The rest, I would not bet your mother's life on. 6. Lazar let the number sit there, small and cold. A year ago he had commanded an army. Ambrose had spent that year quietly hollowing it out from the inside, replacing loyalty to Lazar with loyalty to the man who stood closest to him, so that when the day came, Lazar would be a general with no soldiers, alone in a crowd that answered to someone else. It was, he could admit even now, beautifully done. He had taught half of it to Ambrose himself. The other half Ambrose had always known, so he would not fight it as a general. A general needed an army, and his had been stolen out from under him. He would fight it as what the quarter had made him before the money. And the marble ever had a boy, who knew a building better than the men hunting him, who won not by force, but by knowing exactly where the soft places in the wall were kept. Ambrose expected Lazar Varga, the boss, loud and armored and surrounded, walking into a trap with an army that secretly belonged to the ambush. Lazar would give him someone else. He would give him the boy from above the butcher shop, who trusted no one, who came in quiet, who had already turned the trap inside out before the first guest was seated. They gathered in the gray hour before the sun, the whole strange council of them, Silas, and the handful of names he would vouch for with his life. Zara, awake again, and sharp as a paring knife, who knew the church, who knew the family, who knew where everybody was likely to stand because she had buried half of them. And Amos, taped and aching, who, by every reasonable measure, should have been put somewhere safe and left out of it. Lazar told him so. "You have done more than any man could be asked to do. When this moves, you take my mother, and you go to the safest room I own, and you stay there. This is not your war." Amos Whitfield looked at him a long moment, steady despite the ruin of his face, and then he said the thing that Lazar would turn over in his mind, long after all of it was finished. "She wandered into my kitchen," Amos said quietly, "and I fed her, and I bled for her, and somewhere in that night she became mine to look after, the way she is yours. You do not get to hand me the loving of her and then tell me to wait in a safe room, while other men decide whether she lives." He set his big battered hands flat on the table. "I am not asking to hold a gun. I would be no good with one, and we both know it. But I go where she goes. Whatever the plan is, I am inside it, or there is no plan I will sit still for." And Lazar, who commanded hundreds and trusted 6, looked at the newest of them, the broke stranger with the caved-in face, who had adopted his mother out of pure ungovernable decency, and realized that he had just been handed a soldier no amount of Ambrose's patience could ever have turned. The wedding was set for noon. which gave them the length of a single gray morning to turn an ambush into a reckoning. They could not outgun Ambrose. Silas had made that plain, and the phone had made it plainer. But Ambrose had built his whole patient plan on one belief, the same belief the Volkovs had carried to the black table. The same belief the men in the good car had carried into the quarter. The belief that had cost Amos Whitfield a night of his blood and would now, Lazar intended, cost his uncle everything. They all believed that the people who mattered were the people in front, the ones with the guns and the names and the seats near the altar. None of them ever looked at the kitchen. His mother had spent 2 nights ago being furious about the caterers. Lazar had thought it was grief and stubbornness. Sitting in the gray morning light with the shape of the day forming in his mind, he saw at last that she had handed him the answer before he even knew there was a question. "Nobody searches the staff," Lazar said. "Nobody looks twice at the people carrying the trays. Ambrose has filled that church with soldiers who answer to him, and he has left the one door none of them respect standing wide open, the kitchen. So that is the door we walk through." The plan came together fast after that, the way good plans do, each piece clicking into the next. The catering had been arranged by Ambrose, of course a bland, expensive outfit, chosen to make the food look like money and taste like nothing, and that was the first thing Lazar changed. A single phone call from a voice the catering manager knew better than to argue with, a generous and final sum, and the outfit developed sudden staffing troubles and would be sending a replacement kitchen team, already vetted and already paid. By the time anyone thought to check, the wedding would be over, and the world would be a different shape. The replacement team would be Silas and the 6 men who had never been photographed near Lazar, who would move through the church basement in white aprons carrying warming trays, invisible, unhurried, exactly where the day's real business would happen. And the head of that kitchen, the one face allowed to be seen, sweating over a stove, because that was simply what such men did, would be Amos Whitfield, who could run a kitchen in his sleep and whose broken face would draw not one second look in a room full of people who never truly saw the help. "You put me back in a kitchen," Amos said, when Lazar laid it out. There was something in his ruined face that was almost a smile, after all of this. "You are hiding an army in a kitchen and putting me in charge of it." "I am hiding it in the one place my uncle was too proud to guard," Lazar said. "And I am putting the only man I have known for a single day in charge of it, because he is the only man in this city I am certain no one has bought." He paused. "And because my mother will be in that church, in the front pew, exactly where Ambrose wants her. And I need to know that the person nearest to the door she can reach is someone who has already proven he will stand in it." Amos went quiet. He understood what he was being handed, not a tray. Her, Zara, would sit where they expected her. That was the hardest piece, and Lazar hated it. And his mother refused every softer version of it he offered. Ambrose had planned to ring her with his own people, to manage her grief before she even had it. "Let him," Zara said, "let him seat his men around an old woman he believes is harmless. It is the safest place in the whole church, my heart, because it is the one place none of them will be watching for a threat. She would carry no weapon. She would carry something better. She would carry the moment." When the priest reached the vows, the instant Ambrose's shooters would be told to move, Zara Varga, who had buried half that congregation and could weep on command like the actress she had never been allowed to become, would rise from the front row in her red coat and cry out loud and broken and impossible to ignore that she needed air, that someone please help her to the side room by the altar, and every eye in that church, the killers included, would go for one fatal breath to the old woman in red. That breath was the whole plan. In that breath, Silas and the 6 would come up out of the kitchen, through the sacristy door, with the trays set down and their hands full of other things. In that breath, Lazar, standing at the altar as the sacrificial groom, would stop being the sacrifice. And in that breath, Amos would already be moving, out of the kitchen and along the side aisle to the front row, to put his broad, battered body between Mama Zara and whatever the day still had left in it. The wedding was at noon. It was not yet 7. They went over it, and over it, and over it again, until each of the 6 could walk the church basement blind, until Zara's timing was to the second, until Amos knew every step of the path between his stove and the old woman he had claimed as his own. There was a moment, near the end of it, when the others had gone to dress and to arm, and it was only the 2 of them left at the little table, the boss and the cook, the wolf, and the man who had refused to feed him a stranger. "I have spent my whole life," Lazar said, and he did not entirely know why he was saying it, learning to trust no one. "Because everyone I let close eventually turned out to have a price. Ambrose taught me that. It turns out, he was teaching me about himself the whole time." He looked at Amos, "And then you walked out of nowhere with a pan and no reason, and blew the whole lesson apart. I do not know what to do with a man who cannot be bought." "I have never met one." Amos was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You have met plenty. You just could not afford to notice them. Because noticing would have meant admitting you were surrounded by people you had wronged for no reason." He said it without malice, the way he said everything, a plain fact set gently on the table like a hot plate. But he softened it with what came next. "Your mother is not the only thing worth protecting in this, Lazar. There is still a man in there, under all the marble. She talks about him, the boy who shelled peas. He is not dead. He is only very well guarded." Lazar did not answer that. He was not sure he could. But he reached across the little table, the most dangerous man in the city, and gripped the forearm of a broke widower with a caved-in face. Once, hard, and Amos gripped his in return, and something passed between them in that grip that Ambrose, for all his patience, had never once managed to buy in 20 years of trying. Then Lazar Vargas stood and looked at the clock and went to dress for his own wedding. It was 10:15. In under 2 hours, he would walk into a church full of men, paid to make sure he never walked out, with an army of 7 hidden in the kitchen, an old woman in a red coat for a fuse, and a cook at his mother's shoulder, and he would learn whether the boy from above the butcher shop was still quick enough to turn a grave into a trap. The church was full of flowers and killers. Lazar stood at the altar in a suit the color of a gun and watched them file in. The whole poisoned congregation of it. Volkov cousins with hard eyes and soft handshakes. Vargas soldiers who had called him boss for years and now would not quite meet his gaze. Ambrose's careful men salted through the pews in their good dark suits. Each one, a small patient tumor. His uncle had grown in the body of the family over a slow and loving year. Ambrose himself stood at Lazar's shoulder as the elder of the house, in the place of the father whose grave he had once wept over, resting one warm, heavy hand on Lazar's back. "You are pale, son," Ambrose murmured. "Nerves. Every man gets them. It will be over before you know it." He squeezed, gently, and Lazar understood the second meaning of it, and made himself breathe, and did not turn and settle things with his uncle right there on the altar step, because timing was the only weapon he had left, and he would not spend it early. In the front row, small and straight, backed in her red coat, his mother sat exactly where the wolves wanted her, surrounded by Ambrose's men, and did not once look toward the sacristy door behind which the people she loved and had adopted crouched in aprons among the warming trays. Sabine Volkov came down the aisle in white, cold and lovely, and entirely aware, and Lazar looked at her and saw that she had known all along that the widow had been fitted for her grief before the dress, and he gave her the small stiff smile of a nervous groom and watched her return it and thought, distantly, that they truly would have deserved each other. Ernestine, in another life, 2 blades in the same drawer. The priest began. The old words rolled out over the congregation, love and honor, and until death. And death sat in every 3rd pew in a good dark suit and waited for its cue. Lazar felt the church narrow around him to a single bright point. He knew the moment they would move. His mother had heard it planned. At the vows, when the groom's hands were occupied and his head was bowed and the crowd was wrapped in soft, Ambrose shifted his weight beside him, Across the altar, two of the careful men eased their jackets open. The priest looked at Lazar and asked him the question that was meant to be the last thing he ever heard. And in the front row, Zara Varga rose out of her seat like a struck match and cried out that she could not breathe. It was perfect. It was better than they had drilled. His mother had spent 60 years being told to be quiet in rooms full of dangerous men, and she poured every swallowed year of it into one shattering cry, and the whole church turned, the killers included. One fatal, held breath of every eye dragged to the small woman in red folding toward the floor. In that breath, the sacristy door opened. Silas came through it first, and the six behind him, aprons still on, and their hands were not full of trays. It was fast, and it was quiet, and it was nothing at all like the church had been built for. Ambrose's careful men, watching the fainting old woman, felt hands close over their wrists and cold steel press flat between their shoulders before they understood the floor had shifted, and the smart ones, the ones who wanted to see their children again, went still and let their weapons be lifted from them like coats at a door. The two by the altar were slower, and were put hard against the marble and pinned there before they could clear their jackets. Lazar did not watch it finish, because he had already turned, in the ringing hush, to the one man in the church he had truly come here for. Ambrose had not run. There was that much of the old wolf left in him. He stood at the altar step with the warmth finally gone out of his face, looking at his nephew, at the army that had come up out of the kitchen, at the old woman in red now standing perfectly steady in the first pew with dry eyes, and he did the arithmetic and arrived at last at the answer. "You knew," Ambrose said. "She heard you," Lazar said. "Through a door. In her nightgown. The woman you were going to seat your men around so that no one would ever listen to her." He let it land. "You taught me to watch the front of the room, Uncle. You forgot to tell me you learned everything you know from a woman you never once bothered to watch at all." Ambrose tried, because men like Ambrose always try. He spread his warm old hands and reached for the voice that had read to Lazar as a boy, and said it was Anatoly, it was the Volkovs. They had threatened the family. He had been playing a longer game. He had always meant to turn it around at the last. Lazar let him talk. He let him empty the whole warm bag of it onto the altar between them, because he wanted his uncle to hear, in his own voice, the exact moment it stopped working. The moment the lies met a face they could no longer move. "There is a phone," Lazar said quietly, when Ambrose ran dry. "My mother carried it out of your study in the dark, and a good man stood in his own doorway all night and took your men's fists to keep it out of your hands. Your voice is on it. All of it. The church, the third family, the row of seats around my mother." He stepped closer. "You did not sell me to save the family, Ambrose. You sold me for the chair. And the only reason you are still breathing long enough to hear this is that a stranger with an iron pan bought my mother the one night she needed to reach me. You will not get a night like that. No one bought you one. Take him." Lazar said. That was all. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. And Silas closed a hand around the old man's arm and walked him out through the side door into the gray morning light. What the family did with a man who had sold his own blood was the family's business, and it was not done in front of the flowers, and it was never once spoken of at any table Lazar sat at for the rest of his life. Ambrose did not beg a second time. Whatever was left of the old wolf in him would not let him. Anatoly Volkov was already on his feet in the third pew, his cousins with him, and for one breath the church tilted toward open war. Then Silas and the six turned as one, and the disarmed Varga soldiers along the walls, watching their true boss standing unharmed where he was meant to have fallen, began, slowly, one by one, to remember whose name was actually on the building. The tide of the room turned in the space of 3 heartbeats. Anatoly Volkov, who had come to collect a city, looked around a church that had just changed hands under his feet, and understood that he had brought his family to a wedding that had become very clearly a defeat, and that the only open question left was how total it would be. Lazar Varga stepped down off the altar in his gun-colored suit, into a church that was his again, past the place where the man who had taught him everything had stood, and walked up the aisle toward the father of the bride with his mother's dry eyes on his back and a cook standing guard over her at the front of the church. And the whole poisoned congregation went silent to hear what the groom, who was supposed to be dead, would say to the man who had ordered it. Lazar stopped in front of Anatoly Volkov, in the middle of the aisle, close enough to smell the man's expensive fear, and for a moment, the two of them stood in the wreckage of the wedding that was supposed to have ended one of them. Lazar did not raise his voice. He knew that the quietest man in a loud room is the one everybody strains to hear. "Your daughter is free to go," he said. "She was measured for a widow's dress before she was ever measured for a bride's, and I find I have no appetite for either. Take her. Take your cousins. Take the ones of mine you thought you had bought. I no longer want them, and you will find they make poor furniture." He let the silence stretch. "But understand this, before you cross my door, Anatoly. You came into my city to take my ports, and you were willing to take my life to do it. You reached, through my own uncle, into the one house I keep my mother in." He leaned in, and whatever Anatoly Volkov saw in his face drained the last color out of it. "If a single Volkov shadow falls across that river again, I will not warn you, and I will not chase you. I will simply take everything in this city, with your name on it, one door at a time, until there is nothing left to remember you by. Now take your people and get out of my mother's church." They went. Powerful men, when they have miscalculated on that scale, go quickly, and the Volkovs filed out of the church they had meant to leave as owners, with the particular grayness of people recalculating a whole future in real time. Anatoly went last. He did not look back. He had come for a city, and he was leaving with his life, and both of them knew it was a mercy Lazar could revoke on a whim, which was the entire point of granting it. When it was over, when the church had emptied and the six had quietly seen the last of Ambrose's men out the doors, and Silas had put a steadying hand on more than one shaking loyalist and reminded him whose name was on the building, Lazar went to the front row. His mother was sitting again, the performance run out of her, suddenly and entirely, an old woman who had been awake the better part of 2 days and had just watched her son bring her husband's brother to ruin in front of the whole city. Amos sat beside her in his caterer's apron, his arm around her small shoulders, his broken face grave, holding her the way you hold someone through the part that comes after the danger, when the body finally understands what it survived. He had not left her side. Through all of it, Lazar realized the man had not once looked at the altar or the trays or the quiet work. He had watched only her. Lazar sat down on her other side. For a while, none of them spoke. The flowers filled the silence with their too sweet smell. "I want to go home," Zara said at last, in a small voice Lazar had not heard from her since he was a boy. "Not the estate. Home." And Lazar, who owned a house of black marble with nothing soft in it, realized at last that his mother had never once considered it home. That home for her had always been 3 small rooms above a butcher shop, long since gone. And that the closest thing left to it in all the world was a failing kitchen at the end of the quarter, with a splintered door and a box of a dead woman's recipes beside the register. So that is where he took her. He took them both there, that same afternoon, past the phone store that had once been a butcher shop, down to the water where Whitfield stood, with its soft weathered sign and its broken door still gaping from the night the wolves had come. Amos stopped on the threshold and looked at the ruin of it and said, quietly, that he was sorry, that it was not much, that in 3 weeks it would not even be this. And Lazar took an envelope out of his coat, the plain, thick kind that ends arguments, and put it into the big man's hands and closed his fingers around it. "The debt is gone," Lazar said. "I bought it this morning, before I bought the church a new caterer. It is paid, all of it, forever. And the deed is clean and it is yours, only yours, with nothing of mine anywhere near it, because you would not take it any other way and I would not insult you by trying. This is not payment. There is not enough money in my whole empire to pay for what you did, and we both know it, and it would cheapen the thing to try. This is only me making sure the one bright room your wife built stays open, so that the next lost old soul who wanders in out of the dark has somewhere to be fed. Amos Whitfield stood in his own doorway for the second time in 2 days, and this time nothing at all was coming to hurt him, and he wept as he had wept over the stove the day before. And no one in that little group by the water pretended not to see, because they had all by now wept in front of each other, which is one of the few honest measures of a family. Mama Zara took the arm of each of her men, the son of her body, and the son the dark had sent her, and walked between them into the kitchen and told them both to stop crying and light the ovens, because she was hungry, and she was going to teach the boy from the butcher shop and the widower from the water how her grandmother made lamb, with fire in it, the way it was always meant to be, and there had been quite enough dying for one wedding day. The wolves talk about that winter still, when they talk quietly, in the rooms where men like that are ever honest. They say the Volkovs never came back across the river, that Anatoly sold his ports at a loss inside the year and moved his family somewhere cold and far and did not write his name in large letters again. They say the Varga soldiers who had drifted toward Ambrose came back to Lazar one by one, ashamed, and that he took most of them back, because a man who cannot forgive a single moment of weakness will one day run out of men, and Lazar had learned, late and hard, the difference between a moment of weakness and a year of patient betrayal. They say the Black Marble estate went up for sale in the spring, and that no one quite knew where the most dangerous man in the city laid his head after that. Only that on Sundays, reliably, he could not be reached, and that his phone, on Sundays, went unanswered even by the men he trusted with his life. What the wolves do not know, because it is not the kind of thing wolves are ever told, is where he goes. At the end of the quarter, down by the gray slice of river, there is a low brick storefront with a fresh painted sign and a door that a good carpenter rehung so cleanly you would never know it had once been forced. Whitfield's home cooking. On most days it feeds the neighborhood, the tired and the poor and the lonely, at prices that should have closed it and somehow never do, because a quiet arrangement keeps the lights on, and asks nothing in return except that the kitchen stay exactly what it has always been. But on Sundays, it closes to the public, and the tables are pushed together into one long crowded line, and a strange family gathers that no census would ever recognize. Silas is there, and the 6, easier in their shoulders than they are on any other day. There is a girl of 9 from a stoop up the street who pointed the right way once, and has been given a standing seat and a bottomless plate for the rest of her life. There is an old woman at the head of the table in a deep red dress, sharper and louder and happier than she has been in 20 years, running the whole room like the general she was always meant to be. And there is a man who used to be made of marble, in his shirt sleeves, a dish towel over his shoulder, taking orders in a kitchen. Not enough oil, Amos tells him. Let it get lazy and gold. Gold is Patience Lazar. You of all people should know that by now. And Lazar Varga, who once built rooms with nothing soft in them so that no one could ever reach him, stands at a stove between the two people the world sent to reach him anyway, and lets himself be reached and is not afraid. The lamb comes out at the end, the way it always does, the real way, hot and full of fire, cooked from the hand of a grandmother none of them ever met, and the first plate always goes to Mama Zara, and she always takes one bite and closes her eyes and says it is almost right, almost, next week they will get it. And everyone at the table knows she will say the same thing next week, and the week after forever, and that this is the point. A family is not a thing you finish. It is a thing you keep almost getting right, together, on Sundays, for the rest of your life. A mafia boss went looking for his mother the morning after she vanished. Braced to find a body, he would burn the whole city to avenge. Instead, He found a broke stranger with an iron pan who had bled all night for a woman he did not know, and in finding him, Lazar Varga found the one thing his money and his marble and his careful terrible life had never once been able to buy. Not a soldier, not a servant, a brother. And a road back to the boy who used to shell peas above a butcher shop, warm and safe and loved, before the world ever taught him to be a wolf. That is what Amos Whitfield gave him, without asking, without a price, for no reason at all except that a hungry old woman was somebody's mother. And that is what you do. Lazar did not just walk away from a wedding built to bury him. He tore down the whole cold empire he had made of himself the moment a stranger reminded him what a full table was for. That turn from a man who trusted no one into a man with a family who would burn the world for him is exactly the kind of hard-earned loyalty we live for on this channel. If this story moved you, if you believe the quiet, decent ones are the strongest people in any room, do me a kindness and tap that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs reminding that a single act of kindness can rewrite an entire life. Tell me, down in the comments, which moment was your favorite? When Amos stood in the doorway, when Mama Zara rose in her red coat, or when Lazar finally came home? I will see you in the next one.